Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Eckhart and Coca Report. We are delighted to have back on the show Dr. John Mandrola, who needs no introduction, is beloved. Well, we'll see if he's beloved by everyone. But my last introduction to John, I said that he was beloved by everyone. We will see. This is apropos. But for those who don't know John, John is a cardiac electrophysiologist in Louisville, Kentucky. He's a very thoughtful writer and commentator on all things medicine. He has his own blog, and he's the chief cardiology correspondent for Medscape, and he publishes regular columns there and hosts a podcast weekly, attended by, listened to by many. But John, who, as I said, is beloved by many, got into some hot waters and almost got canceled recently after making a tweet, publishing a tweet related to an article that Dr. Sally Satel had published. So first of all, thanks, John. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're delighted to have you. So I'm going to, the article that you tweeted about is an article published by Dr. Satel. And we're going to have Dr. Satel on the show later in a few weeks, so we may not get into the weeds of her article, but it's an article that comments on the interface between medicine and politics, and she makes the point that, in a way, to use the expression, doctors maybe should stay in their lane. There's too much activism, particularly from the main medical institutions. The AMA, the College of Physicians, everybody taking sort of positions on certain political issues, and she makes the point that doctors are not trained, really. I mean, we're trained for a few things and not others, and we're not necessarily have the final say on things political. And you tweeted the following. I'm just going to read your tweet. You retweeted her article, and you said, "Doctors excel at treating people with disease. That is our calling. Political activism is fine, but it ought to be done only as private citizens." I agree with Dr. Satel. What happened next, Dr. John?
Yeah, so I was struck by Dr. Satel's arguments. I don't know Dr. Satel. I learned about her afterwards, but I thought it were compelling arguments, and I really I feel pretty satisfied that doctors do a lot to improve the world. I love being a doctor, and we're trained to help people with their diseases. And I just I think that political activism is problematic when it's done under the guise of like a medical society or as a group of doctors. We're all free citizens. We're free citizens, and we can do as we please. But it just seems to me that politics and doctoring don't mix.
What was the reaction to your tweet?
Well, I mean, I felt like it was a pretty, uncontroversial tweet. I did it in the morning. I went out for a bike ride and I came back and there were numerous replies. And I was struck, Michelle. One thing I was struck by the vitriol and the strength of the responses. Okay, I've given lectures on social media in multiple states, in different countries, and I kind of thought I was a little bit of an expert in social media, maybe because I was an early adopter. I have never been kicked in the butt so hard by anything. I clearly learned that I was not an expert in med Twitter, and I really did not expect the reaction. I didn't expect the personal attacks. Andrew Foy and I and Vinay Prasad and Andrew Saifu wrote an article called, making the case for a medical conservative approach to medicine. People identified me as a conservative as if it was in the political sense without even reading the article. So I was humbled from the responses, and I learned a lot.
Right. So again, I'm going to read again your tweet. It says, "Doctors excel at treating people with disease. That is our calling. Political activism is fine, but it ought to be done as private citizens only. And you were called a few things. What have you been, in response to this tweet? What have you been labeled as?
Oh, I to be honest, I didn't, I think privileged. This is a privileged position. This is a position. I think that didn't bother me as much as people. Many of the responses were, "You don't care about your patients. You ignore their situation." And of course, they don't know me from Adam. I mean, which I just found it shocking that they think that because I think doctors excel at treating disease, and really political activism isn't our area of expertise, that equated with not caring about my patients' situations. It's just, it was shocking.
I'll read a few. One, of course, this is coming from an older white male doctor, shaking my, SMH, shaking my head. This statement is at best intellectually lazy and at worst medically negligent. Missed the mark. It is always convenient for those who can live this double life. I guess the double life of privilege. I don't have them here offhand, but okay. White male rich doctor argues that doctors shouldn't be advocating for political or cultural change. There's, I think, there is. I don't know that the word racist. Maybe the word racist. Were you called a racist or a supremacist? Or it sort of seems to be implied by.
I don't know if
some
that
of
was
these.
actually used.
Right. So. It's interesting. Were you? I mean, obviously, you weren't expecting this kind of reaction, but it's interesting because you could be politically a political activist on the other, right? With a different kind of political activism that people have in mind, right? Political activism doesn't necessarily mean one set of things, right? You could be a political activist and be against white supremacy, or you could be for white supremacy. So I'm not sure why being against political activism necessarily paints you as being of one political stripe, so to speak, right?
That was the, I guess, can you hear me? That was the criticism, was that, John, you're saying this, the understanding was that you were saying this because you're perhaps you don't enjoy activism in the way that you are seeing. So, and they made the point that Sally Satel, who I think we have coming on at some point, is actually in the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative think tank, and that you're just expressing this because you probably have underlying, you're a closet conservative. Maybe you have a MAGA hat that you wear when you're not doing podcasts, and this is why you're upset, because you're seeing activism in the direction that you don't like. What would you say to that?
Well, I promised myself that I would not talk about what my political leanings are, because I don't think they're relevant to this argument. I'm not for white supremacy, and in fact, I'm sure everybody deplores racism. One of the things that I've read from Otis Bradley, for instance, an academic oncologist who's written about how he was accused of trespassing and he was in his own home because of his race, and I've read Quinn Capers, and I completely deplore that, and of course, as a white male, I don't even know that I can understand or put myself in that position. But my point about activism is that we spend all of this time in medical training. We study like crazy, and the older I get, the more I realize how hard it is to be a really good doctor. I went through a phase where I felt like doctoring was pretty easy, like I had it down pat. But really in the last 5 to 10 years, as I've gotten interested in evaluating evidence, I think it's super hard to be a good doctor. And so I feel like that's my calling. But when I go to, let's say I see a black patient who has heart disease and hypertension, he lives in a difficult neighborhood. Okay, I understand that those social determinants play a role in his heart disease, no doubt. And I take that into consideration when I try and tailor the best therapy. But then let's say I went to the Capitol and I said to the politicians, I said, look, I have a lot of patients like this, and it's just, their social situation is really problematic. And I can imagine them saying, okay, doc, well, we kind of know that. What do you propose? And so this is where I have a problem with an AMA or Heart Rhythm Society or American College of Cardiology advocating for one particular policy. How does knowing how to treat heart disease or do a heart catheterization give us any expertise on solving societal's ills? I mean, do we follow Bernie Sanders' plan or Elizabeth Warren or God forbid Hayek's plan? I mean, we don't know. And so when one group of doctors just advocates for one thing, what if that's wrong? And so I guess I've written, my main thesis in my writing over the last few years is just humility and avoiding hubris. And that was my main thesis behind being careful about activism.
Is it possible that there are things that are known to be true in terms of I think there's a strong belief among a lot of our colleagues that advocating for universal healthcare is something that we should do as physicians, and if we don't do that, it's medical malpractice, or it's not caring about patients. Is there, is that a fair thing to say? Should we be advocating for not just universal health care, but a universal health insurance plan? And if not, why not?
Yeah, well, okay, that's a good question. And here's what I would say, that what a lot of the debate is, yes, we should have universal health care. And I've been to Australia and Germany, and I've been to a lot of countries, Canada, that have it. But what's absent from that conversation about universal health care is, what are the trade-offs? Are we willing to discuss what the trade-offs are? And are we willing to discuss about how does Canada provide care to people? How does the UK, provide care to all their people? And what are those trade-offs? And are we willing to think about somebody saying, well, no, we're not going to prescribe this drug because we can't afford it. It's not cost effective. And if we had those conversations, I'd be all for it. My personal feeling is that, the Canadian system and the UK system are pretty darn good. But gosh, there's an argument to be had there. And that's what I'm for. That's what I'm advocating for, is can we have that argument? And if you go to government and say we ought to have universal care and we ought to do it this way, well, how do you know?
Can the medical profession, doctors in general, speak in one voice about something without that becoming political? I'm thinking about even something like, we had the medical establishment speak about what a proper diet should be, right? For 30, 40, 50 years. And there are political implications to that, right? That means that certain industries will be subsidized, others will be neglected, and so forth. So each time it seems, any topic that if we speak in one voice, it seems that it has political implications. And there are other things as well, right?
That's a beautiful example. Another one that I thought of is, for people have such short memories. It was just a few years ago that the medical establishment was establishing pain as the fifth vital sign. And and if you were against that policy, you were against the humane treatment of people with pain, and that turned out to be an utter disaster. And so, I guess if I was going to be an activist, if I had more characters, if I was more thoughtful about this, I would say that if you wanted to be activism, or be an advocate, I would advocate for the use of evidence in determining the best policies. I mean, for instance, education. I mean, we could easily do randomized trials and looking at the best educational system or looking at social policies instead of just thinking we're right. And that's kind of how I approach medicine. I know you guys disagree with that, but I mean, I just don't know that we know from taking care of patients. I don't know that we know the best social policies. It doesn't mean we shouldn't advocate for what we feel is right, but how can a group of doctors speak? How can a professional society speak for all their members?
Interesting, because medical conservatives, which you're a founding member of the medical conservative establishment, correct? And we have to be clear.
Let's let John define a little bit what that means, so that the audience doesn't get the wrong impression.
Yeah. So actually, I want to give credit to my colleague Andrew Foy, because Andrew Foy, we were bemoaning the fact that at a medical meeting we were discounting a favored therapy, and we got labeled as, I don't know, nihilist or whatever it was, haters or whatever. And Andrew got mad and he sent me basically a bullet presentation of what being a medical conservative meant. And I thought, man, this is great. This is my approach to medicine. And all it means is that a medical conservative is someone who puts the burden of proof of something new on the proponents. And that before we adopt new therapies, we should be careful about the evidence, and we should consider, that content experts, that PCI people or AFib ablationists like myself, we might have vested interest and be conflicted. And, some of this evidence should be adjudicated by neutral observers. And so all we advocated for was a careful, cautious, slow approach to new therapies. That was what being a medical conservative meant. We used the William Buckley quote because it was so perfect. It was so perfect because it said, a medical conservative is one who says stop when everybody is unwilling to do that. And think of Watchmen. I mean, everybody's just sticking these Watchmen in, but the evidence is terrible. And so medical conservative just says, hey, dudes, look at what you're doing. It has nothing to do with whether I ascribe to William Buckley's social policies or not. And I just couldn't believe that was misrepresented.
But would you be okay if the American College of Cardiology adopted the medical conservative platform, or the AMA adopted the medical conservative platform as a matter of policy and advocated in favor of what you wish?
I mean, the medical conservative platform is basically just, show me the evidence, prove to me that something works. It doesn't say don't use clinical judgment. It just says that if you want to start using AF ablation or doing Watchman or using drug X, Y, or Z, show me that it works. Show me a patient population that it works in, and I would be delighted if they did. But that's not a political platform. That's an approach to patient care. And I don't see it as controversial.
Yeah, it's an approach that social conservatives, as Buckley was, also use. Would it be fair for, is it surprising that medical conservatives, who want to see evidence want to see, have a higher bar, shall we say, for changing guidelines or changing what we do routinely, is it surprising that people would then take, you know, your words of caution in terms of activism for doctors as kind of proof that, you know, if you have this philosophy on the medical side of things where, you know, you want a higher bar for evidence for changing things, that, you know, that would also translate over to social conservatism, and where, you know, people are talking about wholesale changes to current society. You know, what was the evidence for going along with, say, affirmative action for medicine, which, you know, now has been going on since we learned from one of your colleagues, since 1969. Should somebody have said then, you know, for social policy, hey, we need to also hold off on this because, you know, well, what is the big evidence? Since we've been doing this for so long and it's been working, you really have to show me more before making this big change.
Yeah, that's a thoughtful and dangerous question. So I could see how people would make that leap. And, you know, my personal opinion, let's just say this, that my desire to have evidence-based approaches does pervade a lot of my thinking on social policies. And I do worry about being wrong, and being wrong in a big way. I mean, just for instance, in cardiology, look at the heart failure, or look at the readmissions penalty program. I mean, it's possible that well-meaning policy is actually harming people. And could well-meaning social policies do the same thing? You know, yeah, I would. Why couldn't that be true?
You know, it's funny, but I think that's not, well, I mean, that could be one implication, but I think that the reaction to your tweet, or the reaction, if I put myself in the shoes of the people who've replied to your tweet, I think for many of them, the social injustices are so dominant in what happens to the health of people, as compared to, you know, what you're talking about, the effectiveness of the Watchman device, or this and that. I mean, that's really, you know, it's a minute thing that only affects a minority of people who are wealthy enough to have insurance to be able to, you know, be candidates for receiving the device. But for them, you know, for the activists, the social problems are so dominant, so evident, so clearly correlated with health outcomes, that it's sticking your head in the sand not to address those things. As a medical professional, I mean, that's really I think that's the gist of the argument. If you're really a doctor, if you really care about the health of your patients, then you should really pay attention to these social issues, because they really dominate, and everything else is just, you know, you know, trivial in comparison. So, and I think there's a lot of there is plausibility to that argument. I mean, more than plausibility, it's actually probably true on the aggregate, right? On the aggregate, it's probably true. But we are not, we may or may not. So do we pay attention to the aggregates to the detriment of the individuals? Because then if you look at it individually, then it no longer holds. Because you actually have poor people who are very healthy. You have wealthy people who are poor. You have poor people who, you know, make the wrong choices. You have wealthy people who make, you know, I mean, it becomes very, very complicated, right? And you cannot no longer draw any conclusions, or the general conclusions that you may draw, you know, fall apart once you look at individuals as individuals. So what is it that anchors medicine in the care of the individual? Or how do we defend that, if that's what you want to defend? Or maybe I should ask you first, do you want to defend that first of all?
Well, first of all, I would agree with you that social determinants are vitally important, and that I can't remember if it was a blog post or a tweet or whatever, but I've I've said often that we should build parks, not cath labs. And clearly, I mean, making society better and more just and more equal, and would improve health dramatically, for sure. I mean, so much of what you said it well, so much of what we do is really on the margin. I mean, an AF ablation in the grand scheme of things is on the margin. But I mean, if you could improve the health of millions improve the social situation of millions of people, then that would be dramatic. But the question is, well, how, and why are we any more? Why are we any better at it than a taxi driver who works in a poor neighborhood? I mean, why is our opinion any better? I mean, economists can't agree on it. Public policy people can't agree on it. So I think we know the problem. But what I meant by the tweet is that we make the world a better place by helping the patient in front of us, and that's a lot. And it just requires a lot of effort and focus. And I think that's a really good way to improve the world. And if I knew the best way to improve societal ills, then I would be all for it. But
Yeah,
I think
but
it's
right,
pretty.
but at the same time, I mean, if taking care of pneumonia or atrial fibrillation or the usual. Sorry about this siren. I should mute myself here. I don't know if you hear it.
Yeah, I hear it. It's
here.
okay.
Okay, but I mean, they would argue that you're equally sort of uncertain about these things, and yet you still practice medicine even despite that uncertainty, and you make decisions that are on the basis of uncertainty. Why not apply that to politics? You should be engaged if you have the interest of the health of the community at large at heart. You should accept the uncertainty of politics, but be engaged politically, because that's where the action is. For those people who criticized you, they're really, I mean, they mean it. They use the quip of virtue, whether they know it or not. They use Virchow's quip, that medicine or politics is medicine on a grand scale, and they mean it. And they say that that's really it's a natural fit between advocating for the patient and being engaged politically. And so what I'm trying to define or to anchor is any break on that thought. I mean, where do you draw the line, and on what basis do you actually draw the line?
Well, I'll turn it around to you, and I'll ask you both, because you've thought about this a lot. But isn't it true that 50% of the population in this country, or thereabouts, feel one way about the best policies, and 50% feel the other way? And if I had political, a pin or whatever, or something on my white coat, and showing that I was advocating for one approach to the best way to solve society's ills, my patient maybe came from the other ilk, isn't part of helping people building trust. And how would it impact the patient's trust if they felt that I was showing signs that I disagreed with their approach to society's ills? So I would just ask you, how does your political affiliations and your public persona of your political approach, how does that affect trust?
I think you're totally right, John. I honestly do. I think this is something I've learned over the last 4 years. I had this mistaken idea that you could separate out the two things. You could be a physician not separate out. You could be a physician, you could hold a political affiliation, and that the larger public patients wouldn't care. It was kind of like this silly notion of, being in high school and being in these Lincoln Douglas debates, right? In those high school debates, you could hold any position you wanted, but at the end of the day, you were all still friends and you all went out and you did whatever, correct? And I had this kind of very naive, simplistic notion of that when I first kind of started writing, which is around 2015 or 2016. And so but that's clearly not the case. Clearly politics, and I don't know if it's the last 4 years, though it seems like when you look back at the times of Lincoln and whatnot, that things were pretty hot and bothered then too. I mean, obviously they fought a civil war where 1 million people died. So it's not like conflict when it comes to politics, which are, deeply embedded, which pit one value system against another. It's not like that's necessarily a new thing in the United States or in the world. But yeah, no, I think I was very, very naive to that. And I think you are absolutely correct that it's so important to separate the two things out. So the things I wrote in 2016, for instance, I would never write now because I think it would affect my ability to be a good physician, meaning a physician for whatever patient was coming in the door. So when physicians coming to see me about chest pain or whether or not they should go for that AFib ablation, I think it somehow even though the politics of it you would think should be removed from that, depending on where you are, it can really, really affect and impact the relationship. So I think physicians should be really, really careful about their politics.
I mean, I agree with you, Anish, and I agree with John, but I think the other side would actually not care so much, because they would say, well, if you hurt the feeling of that one patient, if you damage the feeling, if on the other hand your political ideas are correct and they carry the day, it's going to be a massive win, because universal healthcare would be, I mean, they are so convinced, they're convinced, they have political convictions that are very strong. And they argue that at the end of the day, it's going to matter because it's going to matter on a large scale. Whereas your own relationship with your own patient, that should be, and in fact, it's some of the positions that the American College of Physicians, essentially with their new ethics, their new ethical guidelines, they essentially adopt that. They say it's not just you and the patient, it's not just the individual relationship or the individual interest of the patient, but you should have the global community in mind when you're acting as a doctor.
I think that's bad.
I want to push back against that, but you push back against that by what argument? Just by this touchy-feely thing that you like, your personal relationship with your patients?
Well, I mean, I think that as a physician, I mean, I see my responsibility to the patient in front of me, but I also recognize that argument because we do consider that, don't we? I mean, we consider the societal implications of, say, prescribing a medicine that is super expensive or low value or whatever. We think, we consider that. We do. We try to be good stewards of our limited healthcare resources. But that said, the patient in front of us is our main thrust.
Yeah. So actually, that's a very good point, because I think that's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. Because can you really? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, this notion of, at the end of the day, when you're dealing with the one patient, how do you put that in the balance? The cost of the medication to society versus what your patient needs in front of you. Isn't that, I mean, one is going to trump the other. I mean, or how do you decide, or what? Right? Well, so I think the being the steward of that's a political issue, and you can have an opinion as you said, as a private citizen, so to speak. But at the end of the day, if the patient has an insurance that is willing to pay, at the end of the day, right? An insurance made perhaps the foolish decision that it would pay for an expensive drug, provided that the doctor argued sufficiently well, because what it is, it ends up being a game of persuasion where you try to advocate for your patient. And if the insurance or the government, if it's Medicare or society, has made those foolish decisions, I'm not going to let the patient not have the medication, right? Or not benefit if I think Go ahead.
Yeah, but Michel, you're talking about advocating for policies that can be viewed as relatively neutral. So you can advocate in whatever way for whatever mechanism that ultimately results in a patient having easier access to a medication or easier access to a doctor. right? And you can advocate for that as, I mean, you don't have to say it, but you can advocate for that as a libertarian. You can advocate for that as somebody who is, you know, is from Marxist side of things. So, but it doesn't matter, because ultimately you're advocating for that final goal of you know, of X, Y, and Z, meaning of getting the medicine to the patient. I think where you get into real trouble.
I was responding to John's comment that as physicians, we try to be stewards of the resources globally. And that, I find that kind of a problematic statement, you know, because you know, what does that mean practically speaking?
Well, your command of philosophy is much greater than mine. I'm a pragmatist, and you know, I've been practicing for 2 decades, and I do the best that I can on a pragmatic standpoint. And I have been struck, Michelle, with the lack of so I practice medically conservative. I don't order a lot of tests. I really try and, I mean, I just don't believe that a lot of these tests make a difference, but it turns out that doesn't really get you any credibility or excess. You know, you're still graded in the same way, but I just, you know, I approach it just in a medically conservative way, and I try and use evidence, and if it's time to advocate and push hard for a patient to get something that I think is truly beneficial and high value care, then I fight for it. I mean,
yeah, but John,
it's just reality that we try. I mean, it just seems like the morally right thing to do to be a good steward. I don't even know that it needs much argument.
Meaning he's arguing for the right therapy for the right patient at the right time. And so, you know, he's not necessarily saying that I need to minimize the cost to society. He's just saying that I need to pick the right thing for the patient.
No, but I think in this context, cost is part of it. And in fact, it's a big chunk of it. If all the new therapies were dirt cheap, we wouldn't be having this conversation. The fact that we're having this conversation is because they're expensive.
Exactly.
Because they need to be allocated in a certain way, right? And
yeah, but John, you're not saying that. I mean, are you saying that cost enters into your thought process when a patient is in front of you and you're deciding on a certain therapy? It's probably not, right? You're trying to weigh the evidence, and you're trying to weigh the evidence as to, all right, is this drug going to make a meaningful difference in the patient's life who's in front of me, correct?
No, I think it comes up, Anish. Come on.
I agree. I think it does, yeah.
Okay, I'll give you, for instance, when it comes time to use an oral anticoagulant, I often ask the patient what kind of drug plan they have, or I'll poke my head out the door and ask my medical assistant to look. And if this oral anticoagulant, which is more convenient, perhaps more beneficial, perhaps safer by a marginal amount, is going to be $400 a month for that patient, it's just not realistic. It's not pragmatic. So, you know, we'll talk about warfarin, and we'll go to the warfarin clinic, and we'll do that. So that's what I mean by pragmatism and being a good steward. It's just, I mean, it's just really minimally disruptive medicine that you try and practice, because, I mean.
Well, no, but that's you're having a conversation with the patient. If the patient wants to pay $400 a month, then, I mean, it's not like you're not walking back to the room saying, all right, Coumadin is free, and Coumadin is it. You're by responsible steward, you're offering options and saying, hey, Coumadin is much cheaper, but it's more of a pain. You have to get INRs weekly, whereas, you know, you could use this other drug, and unfortunately, because of whatever payment scheme we have, you know, it's $400 a month. I mean, it's up to the patient can ultimately decide that.
Yeah.
Right, but if I wanted to bring in political activism now, if the AMA or the ACC started advocating for a certain policy to make medicines more affordable, then how would they know what the right answer is. I mean, economists can't agree. Nobody can agree. So I think it's the height of hubris to think that, well, okay, we know the problem of affordable medicines, but we don't know the solution. So why are you going to, put out this statement saying we should do X, but when maybe doing Y would be better?
Right. No, I agree. But and Anish, I think the question of stewardship precisely is not about what this particular patient can afford. It's about how is it going to impact the health plan or Medicare or the government or society in
See, but
general.
that's the thing. I was going to suggest to the two of you that there's like levels of things. So like what I did in 2016, I would never do again in terms of when you select when you say out loud that, hey, I am a Republican or I am a Democrat, right? I think that or I am for Trump or I am for Biden, right? That has nothing to do. So that's easy, right? That has nothing to do with like, why does a patient need to know? Like, you should not have you shouldn't have a "Make America Great Again" sign in your office, correct? That's kind of easy stuff. Then from there, it comes down to, can you advocate for cheaper medicines for your patients, right? And I mean, there's probably nothing wrong in you personally advocating for that. So that's why, John, I mean, I don't think you would have, I doubt, well, I'll ask you, I mean, I doubt that you would have had the reaction you had if it was something that was not something that was off-putting to you in terms of the stance that was taken, right? So like, I mean, would you have, if Sally Satel had written something saying that, we shouldn't be activists about how we get, about somebody, about, and she gives as an example, someone that suggested that we should do away with PBMs, right? I mean, then you probably would not have had the reaction you had. I mean, Sally Satel wrote about anti-racism, wrote about white fragility, wrote about, this type of, I think she touched on, or at least implied this, or maybe you did in your blog, I'm forgetting now, about, we as physicians being required to go to anti-racism training or whatnot, correct?
Right.
It seems to be that there's some like, there's an acceptable range of things that you probably wouldn't have a reaction to. And then there's stuff that's outside of that, right? So like, MAGA hat versus like, advocating against PBMs, as, Wesley Fisher's and Marion Mass, that group that they have that advocates against group purchasing organizations and whatnot, right? And there's multiple ways of getting that are, or surprise billing, and how do we do benchmarks? Do we do this? I don't know that necessarily, you would have the reaction you did. So is it that the stuff that's being proposed is like outside of the acceptable range, John?
Well, I think that, I mean, clearly racial tension is going to be more provocative than pharmacy benefit managers, no doubt. But obviously.
But we should stay away from the provocative things that we all know about. For instance, like pro-choice, pro-life. There are these touchstones. There are these things that kind of get people really fired up, and it makes sense that gun control, et cetera. Should the AMA have positions on those? Maybe not. But if the AMA had a position on PBMs not being, PBMs shouldn't be a part of our current thing, that would probably, be okay. Is that?
Yeah, but I mean, still, I've written and talked about how, and really Andrew Foy again has sort of persuaded me that we need more minority representation in the medical field. I mean, that's a positive, and that's a good positive thing, and I'm completely for it, because after my family, my mentors really get credit for what I've been able to achieve. So having mentors that are minority mentors is a great thing. I guess the question is, what's the best way to accomplish that? And how does my medical degree give me any sway on knowing that? I mean, I know it's a positive and we should do it, but I don't know the best way.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, because I think Anish, you make a good point. At the same time, your medical degree doesn't give you any special insight on PBMs or whether PBMs are, inefficient for society or not. Yet, as Anish said, PBMs, it'd be perfectly acceptable. And I think that's a very good point, because where do you draw the line? And the people who reacted so strongly to your tweet, John, they realize that there's no real line to be drawn, and you may as well go go all
But
the way.
I think that's the important part about John's tweet, that a lot of the, and I by the way, I have to point out that a lot of the folks that responded to you, I didn't, your ratio was so extreme that I couldn't go through all of your replies, John, but a large number of those responses and replies were from, the younger generation of folks. And, I think, I know we're all old heads here. I mean, Michelle more so than, I don't know. I don't know why I pick on Michelle so much. You're the guy with like 6 grandkids or whatever. But, I think for the younger generation that, could care less what I guess the older generation thinks, I think your tweet is a really important message in terms of how to preserve credibility and with that most important person, which is your patient. And I really think it's important. I think it's really complicated, as we're kind of trying to get into the fact what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's the band of, what's the band of acceptability, I guess. But it's so important. It's something I didn't realize just 4 years ago, that you can really damage your credibility a significant amount by taking positions that, are not something that is, necessarily germane to that individual patient in front of you. So, I think your tweet was really, really important in terms of raising that as a conversation piece. And part of the reason it's also so important is that there's a little bit of an, monolithic ideology that kind of pervades most of our medical school colleagues, at least the ones that are vocal on Twitter, which makes it seem even more monolithic, in that there's only one way to think about things. And I think what you did was very important, because you kind of raised the fact that, hey, there's kind of a panoply of different ideas here. A lot of people may think differently, and you really need to think about your credibility when it comes to, taking some of these positions that you're taking. Do you find it interesting, John, that, or maybe you disagree, but it seemed like there was a lot of younger generation, kind of activists that responded the most vigorously to you?
Yes, I did notice that. And one of the things that I worry about a lot is that, I don't feel that old. I'm not as, I don't want to have an old way of thinking. I see it in doctors who are old, and it's just pathetic. And I don't want to be like that. So I'm sensitive to that. And yes, there were a lot of younger people, and I interacted with a few of them that I thought were reasonable. And to be honest, a fair number did interact with me in a congenial fashion. And so it almost, at first I thought med Twitter was hopeless, but then a few of the interactions were actually quite good. And I thought, okay, maybe, in fact, one of the things that I truly believe, and it might be totally naive, is that if we knew each other in real life, and we could interact in real life, and we could see how, we approach patient care and how we agree on so many things, that there really wouldn't be as much vitriol. But of course, med Twitter as a platform, just it's weak in that regard.
Right. But I'll tell you, I agree with you, John. Definitely that if we met each other and watched each other practice, I think all these differences would melt away. But one reason why there's such a generational divide, as you pointed out, Anish, is I think that the older ones, to some extent, we're closer to the tradition that really defines the medical practice that is, I think, the correct one. At the end of the day, which is a practice that is aiming for the benefit of the individual patient. And it's not by being wistful for old tradition, but it's because that's the only way it can be, because health pertains to the individual. Health doesn't pertain to the population. So the concept of health, if doctors are going to be occupied with the idea of improving health, it has to be, and it comes from a Hippocratic oath. It's clearly in the Hippocratic oath. We've abandoned the Hippocratic oath decades ago, and slowly but surely, the new generations have lost, don't have any theoretical framework or something to guide them as to what medicine is about. And so now there's a generational divide, because the older generation still has kind of some remnants, some memory of what medicine is about, and we pay attention to the individual and we can talk about it. Whereas the new generation, they don't buy it because they don't learn about it in medical school. They are, I don't want to be so negative, because at the end of the day, because since it's the natural way of doing medicine, meaning to be attentive to the individual, it stays there no matter what, no matter how we try to get rid of it. But nevertheless, I think it's important to be clear explicitly that medicine is about the individual patient, that it cannot be otherwise. And that once you introduce other considerations of the global, the aggregate, the population, the blah, 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 it confuses things completely. And so
I'll be even more impolite. I think part of the issue is that when you're young, medicine is so complicated. There's so much to understand, right? Imagine, a nephrologist who's been taking care of patients for 10 or 15 years. Imagine the knowledge that they have just from a didactic standpoint, of course, and also just from an experiential standpoint, correct? It's huge, the gap between a first, second year medical student and a nephrologist who's been practicing for a while. And then of course, medical students, right? They're adults. If they were doing anything else other than medicine, they wouldn't be these like fledgling people who basically, I don't mean to, well, whatever. They basically know nothing, right? They're just starting their journey of trying to acquire this knowledge. So then this kind of, you're kind of inculcated into this world where you can make some type of big difference, right? And so, it must be incredibly empowering, especially in the position that you're in, to be able to make some big impact, right? So it's no accident that this estimated GFR business about whether or not to use race when you're calculating creatinine clearance or not, it's no accident that comes from, where does it come from? It comes from, it starts from, medical student body, right? And then, there are some advocates that, that are attendings that are advocating for it, but in general, it's kind of a grassroots type thing. But so I think a lot of it, unfortunately, is part of this kind of existential thing that happens within the medical school body, where it's something that they control, where they can understand. It's reasonably simple concepts, right? Compared to what it is, you or John, have in terms of, the type of interactions you have. So, so we should, I think we should listen to them less, and we should try to.
I don't know.
No, but I think it's a good point, Anish. But the reason it's like that, it's an accident of history. And you're right that medical education infantilizes people. I didn't get out of my training till I was, I think, 32, or after I finished cardiology. It's terrible, and it doesn't have to be that way. And it's that way precisely because of political reasons. I think, John, I responded to your tweet. I can't remember what I said, but it was something to the effect that medicine has been political for decades, and we've accepted it. So with licensing, with all these regulations, with all the insurance, we've grown comfortable with these major, but it's acts of political activisms that have been beneficial to us, who have survived it so far. And so we have to be careful, because we seem duplicitous for this new generation who's having a hard time, whose prospects for a good life is not as good as it was for us, and who now sees these, views things, according to these, critical theory claims or whatever, these kind of simplistic black and white, and it's very appealing. But at the end of the day, we have to be self-critical in a way, and go deep to the roots of where the problem comes from.
One of my regrets is that in private practice where I work, I don't have learners. I don't have medical students. They do come around rarely, but I'm not really exposed to that. And when they do come around, it's like I'm powered by their enthusiasm and their interest. And I don't know, I guess if I was a teacher, I would have the view that, okay, I interact with about 30 patients a day on my clinic days, and maybe 10 or 15 on hospital days. I mean, over the course of years, that's a lot of people you influence their life. And if you were a 1% better physician and multiplied by that many patients, and you were a humane person and a listening person, and you could really influence the world in amazing ways. And I guess that would be my, privileged older male message. And it's maybe totally naive.
Very good point, John. I think that's anything.
I'm just gonna say that Lord of the Flies did not end very well. So we should. I wouldn't say. There's a lot of empowerment. I mean, they're young Padawans for a reason.
Right.
If, without Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke Skywalker would have probably cut off his, multiple extremities.
I'm gonna lock my Twitter account, right? So. Good, John. Thank you very much. Can you tell us where people can follow? I mean, the people who don't already follow you.
Yeah. My Twitter handle is @Dr. John M. If you're, I have a weekly podcast called This Week in Cardiology, and I write a column on Medscape, the heart.org Medscape Cardiology. And of course, I've published some academic articles that nobody reads, but you can find me on PubMed too. But yeah, so thank you for having me. I hope I don't get canceled, but I enjoy
you can join us.
I enjoy talking to you all.
You can move your podcast to the Account and Coca channel.
Excellent.
Hey, thank you, John.
All right.
Thanks,